Welcome everybody on this beautiful late April day. Thank you for joining us for our Wednesday Global Talk. My name is Martin Bunton. I am the interim director for about another 2 months, filling in for our director, Oliver Schmidtke, who is on a research leave in Germany. Real treat today to be able to introduce our speaker. Be a few slides of introduction before I do so. We'll start with our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the center stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. A few housekeeping items very quickly. We ask that you keep your microphone muted throughout the talk and your video off, but when we gather after Menno's presentation for discussion and Q&A, we ask that you keep that microphone off, but if you feel comfortable, if you could please turn on your monitor, turn on your video so that you can kind of join us in this room if virtually. There is, of course, the chat function that Zoom provides if you have any observations or questions or links to share with others. And of course, as you know, the presentation is being recorded. So thanks, Kayla. Great pleasure to be able to introduce Menno Salverda, who has a distinguished CV, but who's most important for us here at the center, who's one of his most important credentials, is that Menno comes as the very proud father of 2 teenage daughters, one of whom is well known to us here, who is Rowan, who's been a tremendous support for the center for 2 years. Menno is from the northern part of the Netherlands. His first language is Frisian, now considered a language in danger of being extinct. I didn't know that, thank you. But of course, languages and their survival is key to what we do here at the center, and of course, is key to our acknowledgement of the colonial legacies of the land in which we stand as well. Menno and his partner Deborah decided to move to the Okanagan in 2004 to be close to Deborah's parents, and now live as the guests on the unceded traditional and ancestral territory of the Syilx people ever since. Menno, thank you so much for joining us, and I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
I'll be standing and relax a little bit and orient my glass of water here. And thank you so much for the introduction, and truly an honor here to be invited. Oh yeah, move from one slide to the other, and I'll try and interact a little bit with both the camera and mostly camera and then with you. So thanks again for the introduction. And yeah, so today the talk will be mostly focused on my research topic, but I'll lead it a little bit into sort of what came before that, because it's very contextualized as to how I arrived there, as well as what it means in my today's world. I work with the Okanagan Nation Alliance, which is a First Nations organization in the Okanagan. So I work with the Syilx, and I hope I pronounced that Syilx. No, that's okay. And Stigma, part of the Okanagan Nation. And so I work with the various communities in the Okanagan Valley on various issues that have been also relevant to some of the themes and topics that came out of this research. Yeah, and if there's chat or questions during the presentation, so I think it'll be about 35 minutes or so, but then if there's anything, don't hesitate to interrupt. So the title of the research, A Framework for Dialogue to Unsettle Knowledge, or Unsettling Knowledge of Taken for Granted Knowledges, but I'll get into it. A little bit about the history, how I got there to the journey, because the whole research is a journey in itself, really. But the journey beforehand, quite a bit was, there was already a little bit in the introduction. Yes, I'm from Friesland. I was connected to the land there through my parents, or mostly my grandpa, who was a dairy farmer, so I really enjoyed working on the land and with farming and animals, beautiful area and with the soil. Also grew up in sort of a Calvinist environment, and that might be relevant later on when I say a few things about what's taken for granted with myself, for instance. Working hard, looking after other people, all these kind of things. Strong work ethic were important in my upbringing. And I've sort of defined a little bit how I started to question certain things. My formal education, I started off with a bachelor's degree in agriculture because the chances of me farming in the Netherlands were very small. So I thought, oh, well, I'll just study agriculture then. That brought me to Africa. And whilst I was really interested in the science part of agriculture, one day I discovered that the chairman of a cooperative dumped some milk in the ditch to keep the price of milk artificially high. And then I started wondering, what's the point of doing all the scientific work around grass and a cow and see how much milk comes out of it when these kind of things are happening? So I started already questioning kind of the science or the knowledge behind that kind of thing. So I thought, I'm sure economics will help me solve these kind of problems. So I went back to the Netherlands and did my international development economic degree. That brought me to Thailand. So the next bullet point, where it took me like 6 years to, let me just say it that way, to unlearn what I had learned at my master's degree in economics. That was really about comparative advantage, specialization, and the aim for me going to Thailand had a lot to do with my Calvinist upbringing, as well as all the theories of economics supposed to support the small-scale farmers in Thailand there to adjust to global markets, to if you grow one crop and you sell it, then you can buy all these other things that you used to grow yourself. Long story short, that wasn't really what was happening. So living in Thailand, working with the farmers, I discovered that their position was actually worsening as an effort of all these initiatives to adjust to globalized market systems. So again, I started to ask more questions about even economics. Working with small-scale farmers in Thailand, creating lots of workshops, as well as designing systems that would make them less dependent on the global markets was important and more resilient. Those kind of workshops that we did there also brought me to Indonesia, and that's how I got to know my wife. And she and I were talking a little bit more about that whole idea of wanting to do development economics or international development, helping the other, so to speak. And like, well, if we really want some kind of change, like maybe the change also needs to happen where we came from the Western world, from Western thinking. So not that we feel like we can do all that, of course, but we felt that maybe it's time for us to go back to the Western world. So via Holland, where we started our family, and Rowan was born in Holland there, we ended up in the Okanagan in 2004. So for those on the Zoom call, perhaps or here, do not know where Central Okanagan is, British Columbia province, and that's the area. And we ourselves live in West Columbia. So a little bit now into the research. Is it sound and everything's going okay? Just checking. Okay. That just a quick sip of water here. How I arrived in Canada, well, first with no job, and then I started working with this group called Community Action Towards Children's Health, and that is an early childhood development group. That was not my expertise, but I did have an increasing interest in community development based on all my experiences in Thailand and Africa as well. And the university I was working with in the Netherlands, University of Wageningen. So I became more interested in community development. That brought me to this group in 2004, worked for them for quite some time, got to know all the stakeholders there, both professionals and parents and clients, who were all sort of gathered together to create the best possible Central Okanagan for young children to grow up in. And that links to all the different disciplines, business, built environment, design, all these kind of things. And a quick jump to later on, but as I was involved in my own research and didn't work for Catching, wanted to still hire me to do some freelance work. So one of the projects was to figure out how do we engage hard to reach families. Now, we felt that was quite problematic because what assumptions are there to decide who needs what help and all these kind of, so again, more questions as sort of a common thread in this presentation, but in my own thinking too. And I try to keep doing that because it just encourages more curiosity. So we got the research a little bit different. We ignored the government who wanted that question. We said, no, we're going to do it this way. How do we set it? What if we set it up really in terms of what can we learn in terms of the relationship of families with organizations? So that's what we did. And we interviewed parents and organizations. And so yeah, this is all participatory work, like with due process and inviting parents and volunteering to participate, interviews were held in coffee shops and all these kind of things. What we learned from the parents was maybe not that surprising, but at the time, I mean, it's really sort of informed the research that I'll talk about in a second now, is that parents were avoiding the very programs and services that were designed for them. So I said, well, that seems a little off here, and at the same time, it's not, we're all familiar with stigma, but so, yeah, maybe not that surprising, but at the same time, it is surprising. We keep solving problems around needs of parents by producing more programs and services. So this is sort of getting into the heart of this presentation. I interviewed professionals as well, and strikingly, they felt quite frustrated many of the times with the system they had to operate in, including questions they had to ask during intake, where they felt, well, these questions are stigmatizing, so why are we doing this? Yeah, so, but at the same time, many of the professionals came from their own experience and really wanted to, with the best of intentions, to support all the parents that they knew had lots of issues, whether that was autism, whether that was all these kind of issues, for which parents then sort of needed to subject themselves to ask for support with these programs. Here's a little cartoon kind of thing. Middle-class white person standing there on the platform saying, well, I guess it's inevitable that a few people will fall through the cracks. And again, I thought this is still up to today pretty much the approach, including dubbing that research. How can we engage hard to reach families as if they really wanted to be reached or need to be reached, and then why? What is that about the cracks? Why couldn't there be more diversity? Why do we need to pull families to a certain level? Why cannot people be who they are? And sort of all these questions that sort of informed how I positioned the research. So now into that research, these questions led me into some of the literature, as in taken for granted knowledges, and I divided, so it was an iterative process with participants of the research, so, which you don't know yet, so I'll just tell you now straight away. What I did was create a dialogue with 12 professionals, and we met 11 times on Fridays, provided lunch, and we created a dialogic environment to sort of unpack these kind of things. But I'm ahead of myself because now you know the research question already, but that's okay. So during that process, we had these thematic areas, and I landed, it probably took me 2 years to figure out how exactly I was going to orient sort of all the findings that came out of this dialogue. But this is what we ended up with, like the area of stigma, autonomous family, and professional power. Some of that research in the literature is already quite old, like Hoffman from 1963, who characterized stigma as sort of a process where characteristics of individuals, of human beings, were first sort of pretty much sort of descriptions of people, but because, as Foucault also pointed out, our interest became more to an individual and an ideal individual, so that became more dominant. So the idea of the autonomous, independent individual, sort of the second bullet point, came into play there, basically resulting in a grid where we had categories of human beings, of individuals, whom we could then allocate to these categories, but we had a judgment with it. So rather than just pure descriptions of human beings, it became almost like a prescription where you say, well, this one is stigmatized, therefore inferior, and in Goffman's words, not quite human, whereas the rest of us are normals. And that's not me, that's that's from the literature. But I think we're not far off from that, and especially working in the indigenous world now and around racism. You can't help but wonder what the underlying value system really still is. So that's stigma. A lot of literature there. I can, if there's questions, I can definitely look into it more. Autonomous family, quickly, it was a bit new to me. My background's not social work, it's not early child development. But my supervisor, Dr. Judy Gillespie, from a strong child welfare background, she sort of really helped me to understand that this was an important piece. So I went into Michel Foucault about this, as well as some Don's a lot. So there's a lot of, it was actually really, really interesting to see how after the Industrial Revolution and liberalism and the idea of the autonomous individual became so important as part of the ideal of economic growth, social well-being of the whole society. But how did we need that? We needed, well, the factories were already there, but for the factories, we needed a specific type of individual who could be productive in that system. So maybe not ill intent, but this drive to that idea of the ideal autonomous independent individuals sort of emerged since liberalism and the idea of science, of a real interest in science and knowledge. And that's how the autonomous family came up, because how do we create these autonomous individuals who could be so productive in society working in factories here? We needed an autonomous family, whereas before the 1800s, it was an extended family. It was really chaotic. So we needed the privacy of a family to ensure the upbringing properly according to certain rules and protocols. And for instance, when we look at the development stages of young children, that's sort of a result or inheritance of that kind of thinking, which again, we're not saying that it's wrong, but instead of descriptions, they now have become prescriptions with all the pressure. And if my kid doesn't achieve that goal or that milestone, then something must be wrong with the child. So that kind of thinking is all part of this. And we needed the autonomous family and specific policies, and this was really striking for me, to actually create that infrastructure for the autonomous family to flourish. Whilst they remain private and free, and of course this is all under the name of liberalism and the freedom of the individual, it was, of course, as I said, this was Don's a lot words. Whilst a name private and free, the family itself could never really be trusted that they would do the good job to create and produce the individuals that needed to happen. Sorry, I'm lecturing a little bit here, but for me, it was really important to sort of understand that piece. Because then, of course, we had the idea that families need to do this, and if they don't, well, then they're inferior, they're deviating from what they're supposed to do. And that explains the emergence of the professional social workers to help families to overcome the barriers or deviations, the challenges that they face to do the right thing as a family. And this was then, of course, determined by all the sciences, psychology, psychiatry, and the PSY field, as who was that again? Nicholas Rose, for instance, and Michel Foucault as well. It all fits there. So then, if in the last 200-300, all that knowledge sort of became taken for granted. But at the same time, we understand these norms are really socially constructed. I know that's a big theme at the center here. And it's really fascinating. Yes, we socially constructed these norms. Michel Foucault has really pointed out that things can change. They don't need to be the way they are. Now, Michel Foucault didn't really provide a recipe then on how will you change actively. He just sort of looked back, right? So, but still really informative and useful for my research, definitely. Now I'm losing my thread. Right, so if these norms then are socially constructed and become dominant, and at the same time, they not only sort of create stigma or might not help, but what's really important, and here's some other authors coming to play, John McKnight and even Village. It's not that it's maybe not that useful to have professional power, but these services, there's been a shift of means and ends where the services now need, if that makes sense. So we have a system where organizations really need parents who need help, because else why do we have organizations? So that's, and if that then causes sort of counterproductivity, because the means to an end is not there anymore, now the means are the end, which is social services, then it causes counterproductivity, and even if it causes that immense, dumps that with a beautiful word, iatrogenics. So basically, you go to a hospital, get better, but you come out sicker. And he applies that with, he's really an amazing, I find him very, very inspiring. He doesn't only apply that to the health sector, he applies that to education too. I'm in an education facility here. You go to school and you come out more ignorant. That's not a reflection on the school itself, but on the systems and on the rules as to how education, and we'll get into that a little more. I had one beautiful example from a parent I interviewed that fits with this. She said, Menno, she knew me from before other research. I trust you, that's why I volunteered to do this, to be here with you, but I have to say, so this was a question about how to engage hard to reach families, although we dubbed it differently, right? But she was still really skeptical. That's what he said. I'm really skeptical because what happens, organizations come to me, they do a survey, and with the outcomes of that survey, they apply for funding with ministry, blah, 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 and then they justify their own job in their organization. So the drive, and it fits with what I just said, John, I didn't even know it, right? The drive is for these organizations to pull out some kind of a need from me so they can justify their job. I don't need an organization to tell me what I need. I just need a sense of belonging. I came from out of country. I only need a sense of belonging. I do not need somebody to have a job to tell me what I need or to provide me with a service that helps me with a sense of belonging. I just need to engage with my neighbors and feel my home. There's no program that's needed for that. So that kind of shows that means and ends and sort of the confusion about it, that sometimes they get it completely upside down. Right, so if then that knowledge is taken for granted and it causes counterproductivity, but they're socially constructed, then I started to formulate my questions more, because if we've learned this, or if there were structures and frameworks, policies in which this knowledge became taken for granted, surely there must be something that we can then undo or learn different. So other than this area of literature, I became more interested in the education itself. So what can be done around the topic of education? So I knew some of the authors. I feel like for time-wise, how we're doing. Okay. I see I get really excited about this. So critical education. So that was my next part in my dissertation to body of research I looked into. I was already familiar with Paulo Freire, so I was only a critical pedagogist of my time in Thailand, because the name of the game there in the not-for-profit world, when I moved away from the globalized sort of push, was really participatory active research. So I knew that book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and he was, of course, world famous with that. And then I looked at the feminist standpoint, theorist as well. So these folks came from the idea that there's oppressed and oppressors, and we need some kind of conscientization process to liberate those who are oppressed so they can see all these things that are happening that make them oppressed, because right now they can't see because of the situation that they're in. I hope that you know, so in the feminist standpoint, it of course from the position of women at first. Now, I thought that's great. I was really with Paulo Freire in a very passionate kind of way. Then I read some more, and of course, being curious, there was some critique to the fields of critical pedagogy. And that's kind of surprised me, because I thought, oh, I'm very revolutionary, I'm very critical already, and Freire for sure, and all the others, and Henri Giroux, and yes, they speak my language. That's exactly what I need to do. But behold, so here there's some critics who sort of put it in the broader context again, and they critique and that those folks over there, the power players, so to speak, that they divide the world in just oppressed and oppressors, and they sort of ignore. And Freire, it's understandable because he went to Brazil with poor farmers versus the capitalist landowners, so to speak. But it's not as simple as that, and perhaps all ourselves will know that every individual is sort of uniquely situated in their own situation of privilege, subjugation. There's so many. Like, I look at myself and I have to say, I'm white, I'm male, I'm heterosexual, I'm middle class. I score many points on the privilege sort of matrix, if you like. Doesn't mean that I don't have some challenges with some oppression here and there, but it's, compared to many others, but it's not a zero-sum game. And many authors have pointed that out, and with empirical evidence, like Ellsworth, has really demonstrated that you cannot divide the world in oppressed and oppressors. And they often quote Marx as sort of the classical viewpoint of Marx is really important in this. Others have said, well, Marx may have been misinterpreted a little bit here. But that's a topic for another time. The classical Marxist position that many sort of claim that's followed here is the division, is a binary division between oppressed and oppressors. And we need some kind of revolutionary pedagogy, conscientization process to liberate those. And it needs to happen, that's the feminist standpoint perspective, as well as critical pedagogy. It needs to occur, this conscientization process or struggle. It is a struggling process, is what the feminists say as well. It's not just open your eyes and you see it from a different perspective. It's really a struggling process. So is the conscientization process of power flare. But what's important is it needs to start with those who are oppressed, because only they are experiencing sort of the marginalization. And those who are, the oppressors are blinded. This is what Henri Giroux says as well. They're blinded by their own privilege. I'm not saying that you're not blinded. I think privileged are blinded. I've experienced that myself many times, whether it's about gender or race, but it doesn't mean that it couldn't learn, and we get to that. So based on these kind of ideas, Freire and the feminist standpoint, mostly the critical pedagogies oriented their education, their pedagogy towards a future goal. And that's the other critical point in education. So it's narrowing your mind, and it's also what name dropping another one, Gregory Bateson, for instance, says if we orient our way of thinking towards one goal, then we might miss a whole bunch of other things. For instance, how we address stigma. We might be so focused on trying to cure autism or trying to do something here that we completely are blinded and not seeing what else is going on, for instance, of our own subject position as a professional, trying to support, but creating stigma at the same time, and usurping the funding that could have gone to community infrastructure, which is now completely broken down, to support people that way, instead of organizations providing more programs and services. So that's, I think, I've been critical enough there. So then what? I was looking at doing dialogue because of that differently, but how? There wasn't really much for me to go by, because Freire obviously couldn't follow that. So what was there? And the critics I was following didn't really provide a framework in which I could put my research. For instance, but it did throw out concepts such as relationality, and this comes back in my today job in a very, very big way. Indigenous ways of knowing, they see things, and I'm not a Syilx scholar, I'm not Syilx myself, obviously. From what I understand is that compared to Western ways of knowing, they see things in a relational way, and it's so much more powerful because you see all the connections. Humans to the land, humans to ancestors, humans to the future, the importance of ceremony and understanding and framing your mind as to what is important. And dependency relationships that we had a little chat about sockeye salmon. I can talk, I love that topic too, but how complex the connectivities are and not understood by Western ways of thinking. So I was more interested in the relational aspects, so drew from indigenous ways of knowing, as well as including Sunday Grande, an indigenous scholar, who said, really, we don't need to look forward, we need to understand what currently is. She called it sort of a negative pedagogy. So that sort of stuck with me and said, yeah, we need to sort of unsettle the knowledge that currently is happening. Or that if we want to do something, then the knowledges that are taken for granted, we need to sort of instill a process, some kind of a dialogue that helps to unsettle that taken for grantedness. And then I found that later on with Michel Foucault again too. It's always nice to see those images again. So we wanted to focus on our understanding what currently is, rather than orient towards a future objective. So critical pedagogists want social justice. That implies that they think somebody is there who can oversee that. Oh, they are not conscientious enough. We need a conscientization process of which we know how that should look like. Then they will be liberated and see what, like, are you already seeing that? So the assumptions around what they critique themselves, teacher, student, teacher, like the teacher knows more, they actually critique it, but then they fall back into the same binary thinking. And now I go back, so I'm sorry about that. But so instead of that future orientation to that goal, we really want to understand what is. So expand our sort of screen of consciousness. That's what we want the dialogue, what I wanted the dialogue to orient towards. So then the research question, finally there. Overall, what kind of framework would lend itself for these knowledges to be unsettled? So, and then sub-questions. So then I looked at these three areas I mentioned before to explore them with these professionals. What was unsettled and how? And I didn't say yet why professionals. So I chose professionals because I wanted to also look, because of the critiques I read and the critical pedagogists saying, and standpoint theorists saying that this liberation can only occur through engagement with those who are oppressed. But then there's a lot of other folks that say, well, that might not necessarily be the case. Plus, if we really want to shift, sort of look at power differently, there's no way out of this other than we have to also include the privileged, even though the group of privileged doesn't really exist. Having said that, of course, I did the research with the group of professionals, so I did pick them as a binary group, and you might say you're actually, through that process, perpetuating the same binary. My defense there is, it happens, this is our society, stigma occurs because of that binary, and I'm not claiming that I'm organizing an education for them. I'm not like Frères, I'm not educating the powerful or the privileged professionals. I'm engaging them in a dialogue to unpack, just to try and understand what's going on from this specific perspective. If I brought in clients, parents in that group, we would have to deal with the power dynamics that organize stigma in a very complex way, and it would have taken a lot longer. I can dwell on that afterwards, because I'm not saying that mixed group is not possible, but I chose for one group of professionals. So then quickly, what was this framework? So how did I draw from all these authors in the thinking? What did this framework actually look like, or what were the elements? Just through here. So I'm going to look a little bit at context. What learning models did I use? Participation and learning strategies and ethics. This is just as a quick introduction. So context, affinity group, I just talked about that. So the group of professionals. Important, that was my choice. The goal was, I also mentioned that, is to unsettle, not to achieve. We're not going to solve stigma. And every time we explain that, and we constantly address that with the participants. You don't need to worry. We're not going to solve stigma. We're just going to try and unpack things. Trust, I already knew, was really important from all the literature and my own experience as well. And the role of the facilitator, that was me, is not to teach, but to improvise. That was harder than I thought. Then what kind of learning models? I'll just, the camera still see me this way. So quickly, learning models, I drew from inquiry-based learning, which basically instead of solutions, we try to get to better questions. So we start with the group of professionals with one question, and then sessions and sessions after, we just develop those questions further. I drew from other education folks. They would call experience and reflection of social learning, cyclical learning models of interest here, as I now see this in the work I do today with Syilx methods of knowing. And it's kind of embarrassing. So this kind of has existed for thousands of years, and then an academic comes and dubs it social learning, and I use it too. And it's already out there, right? But anyway, double loop learning, where we not only ask the question, are we doing things right, an efficiency question, but also really question, are we doing the right things? The third, of course, is how do you know what's right? Reflexivity, I mentioned here explicitly, very important. It's a bit different than reflection, because it really puts you as what did I learn, how am I situated in that dynamic relationship with clients and other professionals and my board, for instance, where you're not reflecting upon something you've learned, but you really put your own body and thinking into this learning process. Ethics, quickly, white male and facilitators, so there's power dynamics within the group setting. We discussed it explicitly. Most participants said, "Man, we know you from the past," so I had built some rapport with participants, which I think was important. But nevertheless, there were still moments where this became very important to be aware of. And I also didn't want the participants to feel like this research was about some kind of a judgment or a measurement if they could learn something, if they were smart enough to unsettle. It was never about an individual cognitive ability that I was measuring. I was only, yes, I did say some folks unsettled more than others, but I was looking at the dialogue framework, what happened in the dialogue that made that happen. I wasn't at any time, it was like, oh, you're not smart enough to unsettle, for instance. That was not the point here, and that was not any of the assumptions. It was always a reflection on the overall dialogic framework. So this is more fun too. What kind of tools in your lecture, that's a sort of class, right? It's education. What kind of tools do you use? We use debates. Don't use it on the first date. There's not enough trust and we don't get enough out of it. Lots of reflections, articles about indigenous parenting with Maori, and then summarizing, having small group conversations, lots of dialogues, lots of reflections. Free writing as well. And then mind maps, one of my favorites. This you can use in the very beginning, and of course our topic is stigma, you put it in the middle, and probably familiar to many of you. And it's sort of a brainstorming kind of way of what is your initial idea of what stigma actually is, how would you define it? How did I collect data? I'll go through this a bit quick. So I know the focus group was obviously central, but I did semi-structured interviews afterwards, and I'm so glad I did that because a lot came out that I hadn't seen as I was facilitating about myself too, as facilitator / trying not to be teacher. Surveys were important because I did want to sort of measure, do people feel trusted, or do they show up because of other reasons? Do they feel respected? Is their voice, do they feel their voice is being heard? And this was anonymous, and I did that twice to just kind of make sure that we're all okay. And we shared the results, again, with the whole group, and if there was an issue, you deal with it. Email reflections, beautiful, so many emails, and really with a bunch of the participants who really showed some commitment. I had one participant, and she wrote me 1 o'clock in the morning. I read this story to my daughter, and it made me think it was about the story of someone in Paris. And I'm living under the bridge, begging and finding another one who was marginalized, and it was an interaction. And it made me think of today's dialogue. And 2 pages of reflections on the interactions of that day and the stories you read to the daughter. So they get you going. It's really beautiful. My own reflections, I mentioned that too, is very, very important too. If I hadn't done that, I absolutely would have come up with some other conclusions here. Now, in terms of conclusions, then here we go. What was unsettled? So let's take a breath. I feel like I'm talking quite fast. What was unsettled? first of all, the meaning of stigma. I'll just maybe use an example here. Whereas in the end, you saw that mine met with stigma in the middle, and one of the participants have been struggling with this idea of stigma, what it means. Like many were trying to tell me that somewhere in society, and somebody would tell me you feel stigmatized. Well, I'm not stigmatizing you. That's on you, right? So very individual sort of perspective towards stigma. And I can say this now because afterwards he came up with huge aha moments that I'll mention now. So after that, so she was struggling with like about 3-4 focus group dialogues that way. And she constantly, but you could see she was curious, she was dedicated, she was really passionate to try and figure this out because she had really bought into this question of the whole research. And no, I thought, let me go on another tangent, let me not do that. And so she said, so what I did learn was many of the clients we received might have already pretty sort of ideas as to who we are as professionals. I see that now because we are powerful. We're supposed to be the ones who know to help. So that sort of informed her thinking, I'm going to approach this a little different. So she knew this woman had just migrated from Pakistan, had a little kid, husband works, and was pregnant. So she sat down, so instead of me asking what traditionally we would do from a taken for granted knowledge perspective, how can I help you? What do you need? She turned that into something different. She said, hey, you're from Pakistan. Let's have a conversation. Tell me a little bit about what is it like for a Pakistani woman who's pregnant and has a little kid in Pakistan. Well, she went. So when that's the case, and you can't quote me on this, I didn't follow up with that body of virtue, but from this anecdotal information, when you're pregnant in, and I think this counts for many South and Southeast Asian communities, I can speak for Southeast Asia, I've been in Thailand for 6 years. When you're pregnant, you're the queen. People ask, can I look after your daughters if you have to go to the doctor, if you do this? Do you want this meal? Do you want something? Can I help? And it's truly mind-blowing how much support there is. So the professional part of our research, she started to reflect, wait a minute, the reason we're trying to help you has nothing to do with you being a migrant from Pakistan. It has everything to do with how we've socially constructed our community and society. Central Okanagan, I should correct, because we're in Victoria, Vancouver. What I discovered in the Central Okanagan may be slightly different, right? Or very different for that matter. But this is place-based, so I just need to make that quick correction there. So in the Central Okanagan, in that context, where this Pakistani woman did not feel okay to ask the neighbors, and well, I can recognize that. It's really not done. It's an individualized society. You need to look after your own kids, after your own family. It's not done, and neighbors might even feel very scared to look after somebody else. Anyway, all these kind of norms it was clearly completely different than what was happening in Pakistan. So this professional was kind of thinking, my goodness, I'm not trying to help you because you have a need. What the struggle here is everything to do with Canadian society. So this is where the reflexivity came in, about our own sort of assumptions as to what families need to be, need to do, and how that is a struggle for if you're new or if you're different. And if you basically just diverse as well. And so that was her aha moment, and she said this was the beginning of the focus group conversation. I think it's through the whole agenda, but this was the conversation. It was her aha moment. So from then on, so this is also an example, right? Yes, knowledge was unsettled, absolutely, with her, because she was interpreting the relationship very different, as well as put it back into sort of this whole context of taken for granted knowledge is in society. Seeing others through labels, another one that came up, which I learned again in the semi-structured interviews at the very end, mostly, where people, quite a few had expressed, I felt quite silenced on focus group number 1. And I was puzzled and I was kind of upset with myself. My goodness, I did so my best to create a level of trust and all these things. Now, not to say that over time that trust did, and people did always came back. We lost one person, but everybody came back, even though they didn't have to, right? So they really treasured sort of the time together, and trust was built And that's when they said also, because of that dialogic process, we got to know one another as human beings. But on day one, when people were introducing themselves and said, I'm social worker, blah, 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 I work with this organization, we're really big, I have a master's degree. For the ones who didn't have a master's degree, they felt silence already. What am I doing in this group? I'm not going to contribute. I better stay quiet until those folks have said something. So this was real, and this was happening. So in very subtle ways, this has been happening. But most of us said now we know each other, not as labels, but as human beings. It doesn't mean the labels are gone. At first I thought labels are terrible, but it's not necessarily the labels are terrible. It's the judgment we attach to them and the fact that we can't see the human being beyond the label. And of course, in the context of helping parents, it's everything about the label. So no wonder parents are avoiding that, because that's the object they are being when they are visiting professionals. Most of the time, not to say that that cannot be unsettled, because of course it can. And it doesn't make professionals bad people either, obviously. It's all contextualized. So practice. So some of the professionals said, now I know more about this. I've changed my office, my desk, so to be more accommodating. Some said, I remember the question said, some intake questions about income or what have you. If I feel to stigmatize it, I'm just not going to ask them, regardless of what the funders want me to collect kind of data. So I'm just not going to do it, because now I know what it does to the people I engage with. There was an anti-stigma training happening at the same time or being planned, and suddenly people started to wonder, hey, before we would not have any questions about an anti-stigma training. It would be assumed that that'd be a good thing. Now they were wondering, given their own experience of these aha moments, for instance, on what kind of framework is this anti-stigma training based? Is it addressing unsettling their own knowledge? Is it, so they had questions. Not to say that it's not good, they just had questions, whereas before they did. And that's the unsettling piece of it. And transfer happened too. We had one session where, and this is where my teaching, my own sort of transfer happened too, where the experience of single women, and there was 3 stories being it, and it was very emotional, lots of crying, but also very, very passionate and very exciting, because we learned something that we hadn't known before, this struggle of a single mother in the Central Okanagan. And so by the end, we were all sort of excited, including myself, and this is where it's a bit of a challenge for me to express that too, but yes, I learned something new, so I kind of jumped on that knowledge. Hey, we've learned something about single motherhood. This was a great session today. Weeks after, I started an interview with another woman who was married, who basically told me, what was all that? Like, how can it be that single mothers think they have it harder than me being married? And another reflection on later Menno thing, me thinking, how dare you judge that? That was so fantastic that we learned that. But of course, I didn't see her situation, and who am I to judge her thinking that when she's entrenched in her own situation of power, privilege, and her situation as a married mother being in her local context. So what we missed there was another round of unsettling. Yes, we learned something, but we didn't unsettle further, because this would have been a great opportunity, and we missed it, to bring that into the conversation. What is it then like? How do married mothers, or in this case, what do you think? It would be wonderful to have that. On the bright side, I'm happy that she was disclosing that with me at the end, so she felt trusted enough to disclose it. And then I had to do some own reflections to really see also the bigger picture. And if I hadn't done that, was my point, if I hadn't done that reflection, I would have missed it. And if there hadn't been the trust, she would never have told me. I would have missed it completely. So now the education piece, how is it unsettled? I think we can safely say that the affinity of sharing, so the affinity being, we are a group of professionals, we don't have to deal with walking on eggshells and very difficult dynamics of power dynamics with clients. We're a group of professionals, as such we share that. as well as a buy-in into this research. Or so I thought. Not perhaps after, in hindsight, not everybody was bought into the same way. And previously I thought, yeah, well, maybe I'm making a mistake by just looking at the professionals. And I think I myself was judging professionals as too monotonous, as too one group. And now I went, no, there's so much incredible diversity. The experience, we had 2 Indigenous women in the group, we had 3 single moms, but all their individual experiences were very different as well. And how that then affects them living in their, on the schoolyard with other moms who they feel they're being judged by. So it's really hard for them to live their lives because their kids need to be extra good in doing their homework and their shoelaces and because there is that societal stigma towards single mothers. In Central Okanagan, I've heard in Vancouver some study that it's not everywhere the same, right? So in this case, and also had I had other professionals, who knows what other knowledge would have come up, but this was based on experiences from these individual participants. The open process of reflexivity was really beneficial. All the participants explained that it was so wonderful that they didn't have the pressure of scoring an A. They didn't have the pressure. They could be free and open-minded to ask more questions and not be afraid that the question was not a good question. But or else this woman I mentioned would not have come to this aha moment because she'd feel too frustrated and the need to, and even the need to solve stigma, because stigma, yes, was a big issue and people kind of probably felt some pressure. We want to solve that problem, but this took that pressure out. And then here's still a question, because some of them were really curious, driven by their curiosity. They were dedicated to find out. Others were not so much. And so I still have a question, how can I reel in the others too, that were perhaps not on their own account spending a lot of time on reflections or reflexivity. But those who were curious and motivated, I didn't have to ask. I didn't have to create the space because they were automatically already doing it. And even though I had, of course, built it into the design, reflection, not everybody did. A little self-critical note here. Facilitator often falls back into teaching mode. I think I alluded to that during the presentation. Yes, I get excited about certain things. For instance, the story about single mothers, I was excited about it and forgot to unsettle more. I also, one session, I reflected on it, my experience from here, and here this would be really great as an opener for the next session, and I did, and I transcribed everything myself, and I noticed how much time I was talking. And me talking is not reflective for the participants. So, and it was obvious, there wasn't as rich of a dialogue after that. So, Menno's learned this lesson really well. If you want to facilitate this kind of thing, don't try and fall back into teaching. It didn't mean, they were all laughing about it when because I disclosed it with them afterwards. I said, this is what I found from last session. I spent 40 minutes from the whole session, me talking to you. I apologize. And they were laughing. So, but maybe you still have wonderful examples and this kind of thing. And it's still valuable. I'm not saying that you cannot, right? You can still, I'm still also a participant in the research, and I have my own stories to share too. But I have my power as facilitator. I have my power, like I need to really play with that. And I'm not teaching, I'm facilitating, so I need to be careful with that. Conclusion, affinity group. All right, so towards, is that my time? You're good. Okay. It's complete. A few more slides. So again, a little dig to the critical pedagogists and the standpoint theorists. Groups of privilege can unsettle, whereas they felt they couldn't. And I was quite explicit. We need to start this dialogue with the oppressed. So in the context, and I should articulate that, in the context of this situation where professionals, clients, and program services in the Central Okanagan feel stigmatized, that group of professionals, or at least a good number of them, with that context and dialogue, they did unsettle and they did change. So despite aiming for it, I found this always quite a powerful statement too. Because with designing a curriculum for a class, you always have your learning objectives first. This is what we try to achieve. Here, it's quite the opposite. We're not trying to achieve anything. But because we didn't aim for anything, any change still did occur. And that's what I find really powerful with a pedagogy that's sort of a negative pedagogy, if you like. Change still happens. You just don't know in advance what it is, and that often scares folks. Diversity is based on sharing, is the base for sharing. So despite the fact I had an affinity group of professionals, the diversity was so enormous with all their individual stories. It's mind-boggling how diverse it was. So you can learn, you can unlearn. It's no hesitation. You don't need to worry about that as a factor for not doing mixed group dialogue, because there's still a mix. Also want to make clear, despite there's a field that wants to, in response to Paulo Freire, who's a pedagogy of the oppressed, we need a pedagogy of the privileged. That's not what I promote here. I promote pedagogy with the privileged. For instance, that's what I've done. Not to design something so they would be conscious of whatever was happening. We were just exploring and unpacking and understanding what was going on from their own perspectives. So it's not a pedagogy for the privileged. I want to make that really explicit. All right, in terms of processes, I mentioned this, the open process creates a lot of freedom, so not that pressure, I mentioned that already. And the inquiry-based, so if you're wondering how can we do this, inquiry-based teaching or learning provides, is very well aligned with unsettling. Fixed with social constructivism, that's a fancy term in the education, but it comes from there. And then reflexivity is key to a different praxis. So reflection and then reflexivity, how am I situated in this, the examples I mentioned. And it changes into you practicing differently because now your stream of consciousness is broader. Your like epistemological and ontological foundation, basically the ground on where you stand that's considered a knowledge based on which you design practices is very different. Yeah, maybe I can say there, for instance, in my current work, I work, for instance, with Interior Health and MCFD, and they operate from a certain knowledge, and there's lots of movement there happening too. But it's at the same time still based on an individualized, very often individualized approach. So health there is sort of not being sick, whereas in the work that I do with the Syilx Nation, what is, yes, we operate from that now too, but what is really desired is to kind of, what is wellness from a Syilx perspective? How did we interpret that? And then what's lacking from that? That should inform our investments, not avoiding being sick. Not that that's not important, but that one is missing. The role of the facilitator, I alluded to this, so with that example where I was really self-critical and beautiful at the same time, because I really learned the hard way. It's a constant balance of, if you're in the unsettling business, to keep unsettling. There is no one knowledge that holds the capital T truth. And I fell into that with learning about single motherhood. Not to dismiss that knowledge, that's there, but it cannot happen at the expense of somebody else being silenced. Therefore, it's a constant, ongoing, dynamic process of learning something and immediately unsettle that, question the assumptions behind that knowledge and what it does, and make it relational to others, which is really exciting and also very complex. And it's all about, yes, creating then that space for individual experiences to emerge, because everyone is uniquely situated in their own constellation of privilege, subjugation, marginalization, whether it's race, ableism, gender, and all these isms, right? And lastly, yeah, be reflexive about self and finding. So this is particularly about the role of the facilitator. Because if I'm not, I miss something. So some of the new questions, build it into practice. So as I mentioned in my today's world, with looking at the Syilx, how do I work this knowledge into working with other organizations to try to work with indigenous populations and sort of encourage this curiosity or questioning and unlearning, if you like. How can one do that? And I'm applying it here and there. but systematically, it's still, of course, a huge challenge. I'm very curious about, there you go, about the curiosity. How is it that some were really already that curious? And maybe there's something else that needs to happen to instill that curiosity, to plan something that, oh wow, yes, this is what I want to be involved in. Because not everybody did. So there was a few who still sort of spoke the same language as when they started. So clearly some kind of open-mindedness or some kind of tools really need to be in place to instill that curiosity, if you like. Yeah, and this is just an open question for Central Okanagan. So this is the case study, Central Okanagan, with lots of references here and there. I think that's it.
Thank you so much.
Let's sit down.
Yeah, please do. So, and then you and I both will kind of negotiate back to some people and others. So, thank you. Please, if for those of you who feel comfortable, please do put on your video, and then let us know if you have a question or a comment, either by raising your hand or using the Zoom function or something of that sort. But first, thank you so much, Menno, for coming here and sharing all this with us. And congratulations on, wow, what a project, and all the learnings that you're sharing with us. One of the really exciting things about the position I'm in here at the position of entitlement and privilege that I'm in here at the center is you're learning so much about that what is, the case studies, and then we learn every week so much about, well, how do we learn about the what is, and what do we do with those learnings and the approaches and the methodologies. And so you've tapped into so much that's interesting here too. Thank you. Yeah. Would anyone like to lead us off? I have a couple of thoughts. Sorry.
No, you go ahead.
Sorry, I had my back to you. Yeah.
I don't have a question. Actually.
Okay.
I have to be more careful with what I do with my hands.
Well, I just wonder if you could speak more to, because I know you have, but I mean, there's so much to unpack here, right? But on the one hand, you started from that idea of wanting to understand what is, and you put that is into sort of, I think, bold with italics, right? And I wonder to what extent and I suppose this is really at the heart of some of the issues we're talking about, but like, is there and is there, right? Because to some extent, there's a process here. People are disclosing experiences, you're learning and reflecting on them, and from this, hopefully our knowledges and our assumptions unsettle. Yeah. But to what extent are the people who are disclosing experiences being unsettled in that process, and thus changing the is that is out there? And then does it become sort of more complicated that way, that in the process of disclosing an is, that is being unsettled and turning into something quite different by the end of the process? Yeah. Which is, in a sense, what you're looking to do, constant change and curiosity, but in the process changes what the is was in the first place. Is this making sense?
Yeah. I wouldn't say makes complete sense, because no, I think I hear what you're saying.
I think what I'm asking is, to what extent are the people you're learning with, yeah, to what extent are they becoming unsettled in all of this, right, at the same time as the knowledges and assumptions about them are being unsettled?
Yeah, well, so that's where the reflexivity really comes in, and I have tons of these aha moments, right? So
that's what I wanted you to speak more.
I think these,
on the aha moments.
Right. So these aha moments are really, they're really it. So if you look at what it is, so the question, and this was somebody else saying, I do tend to jump in tangents and lose my beginning point, but when you were talking, what reminded me was what is a quote from Michel Foucault. I might have a sticky note there, but I'll just paraphrase now. So after all of that, sort of what Foucault was saying, what resonated with me is perhaps our job is not so much to become who we need to be according to sort of the systems, but to refuse who we are. So, and in this case, so what I think we try to sort of establish dialogue is really sort of the dominant norms and expectations of professionals to treat clients, and vice versa too, for clients or patients to subject themselves. And that's how power operates, because disciplinary power. It's not as simple as you can hand over power from one to another. So this is what makes it so incredibly complex, because I'm white. I cannot just unwhite myself. I mean, but what I can, and as a facilitator in the process, what I can do is, so what currently is in my situation as a teacher, I teach stuff. I try to have people learn something. But I'm shifting that, in that power knowledge dynamics, I'm shifting my own disciplinary power. So I'm orienting that power knowledge dynamic, not towards teaching, and that's my responsibility, I feel, but towards unsettling, towards facilitating more process. So in terms of, so that's my own findings, so that's not exactly what you were asking. I'm trying to make the link here, but so for these professionals and the aha moments, it becomes much clearer for them how they're situated in that stigma, in objectifying and seeing people through their labels. And it's a challenge at the same time. So sometimes they say we don't really know what to do here, because the client doesn't want me to be sort of human. They want me to objectively sort of give me this assessment so I can get the funding. So they don't really, it's not always in their interest to unsettle either, because of the broader context in which funding and many of the clients need to subject themselves to that label of whether it's autism or something, or client, so they get the services that they need. So the process of moving towards John McKnight's sort of more community infrastructure where we can support one another, that support is not there, that system is not there. So to unsettle, this is my biggest question, to further unsettle, and create critical mass to really systematically change things. It's just really hard, because we're all stuck in the same thing and we depend on it. So clients might not want to, because they depend on the funding, or else the kid doesn't get support with autism or whatever it is. But in the process, and that came out of our initial research too, like parents will be quite hesitant to go seek help until they don't really have a choice anymore, because they feel reluctant to say my kid has this or that, so there's a big deal of reluctance happening in sort of that disclosing of that subjectivity.
Can I come at it from another perspective? That's very, very helpful. But those, because I keep coming back to those aha moments too, in terms of is there any, to some extent, might have there been an assumption on your part? I know we're thinking that people have not yet had an aha moment. So, for example, bring it on. Okay, that's what I'm sort of getting at, right? Because what about people who maybe have been through such a process before, or otherwise familiar with the literature or something of that sort? Were there those times when there wasn't so much of an aha moment because they were already aware, or they'd already been unsettled, to kind of simplify?
Yes, I think more the opposite happened. I think there was some reluctance of participating because I have a master's degree in this. I actually heard that in some of the reflection individual interviews. Yeah, I heard them talk, even the same amounts, even those others who had aha moments were kind of dismissed by that as well. Because I have a master's degree, I already know this. So there was on the opposite side, and it's, I know I have to tread carefully here, but there was an assumption, this is how people got into it. But that doesn't mean that I'm not saying every master's degree can't unsettle, or was, but it was perhaps for some quite difficult to engage in unsettling their own knowledge, because they couldn't step away. This is what I mean with the curiosity piece, because some of them weren't ready or didn't want to. And maybe they were motivated to participate because others were participating, or because it was a UBCO process and it's prestigious to be part of the research that UBCO takes part in as a not-for-profit, Who knows exactly what the underlying motivation might have been, but there has been these situations. But then your question, I hear it, but in return, that might then assume that unsettling is sort of a goal in itself, and then you've reached some kind of end situation. But you can't.
No, but you can't, right?
It is never ending.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's what I've found so far, and I think she's completely underrated actually, but what she did there, the discovery that every individual has, you can't judge somebody by any label because it's completely complex for every single individual. You can't. And that's a critique to the intersectional family, because they still try and compartmentalize in the process of progressive sort of change. They still use the labels and the categories in order to sort of what's the word? Revolutionize or liberate or work, some progressive action. But it's really a constant process of creating the space for more and more unsettling, and it's slowly down. And I think this is why it's so difficult, because whether in education institutions these kind of real dialogues often don't happen. At the same time, it should be precisely in the education institutions where it needs to happen. Once you're a professional, there is no time. That's what I heard them say too. There is no time for these dialogues to occur. And so I had the buy-in of both the managers and the professionals volunteered to participate in 11 focus groups. I provided lunch. Did I thank the funders for that? Funders, thank you, MyTax and Catch and Success by 6, they provided the lunch. And then that was a good thing. So it's a playful thing, but there is no such thing. Somebody is unsettled.
No.
And we only have unsettling moments in our experience. And so here's the dip to reforming the whole education institution. There is no such thing as achieving a learning objective, and then you know it. It needs to, then you know what, based on whose assumptions and whose values.
So when somebody asks me how the global talk went today, and I'll say I found it very unsettling. And they'll say,
perfect. It's completely disrupted my way of
but that's part of the assumptions we have that that's a bad thing.
Yes.
Rod, please, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for this unsettling section. I was intrigued right from the start as you talked about the problem of unlearning all your economics training. I really felt major sympathy there. But I have so many questions here. I wanted to pursue maybe two. You talked about, you had a comment that as a result of all of this, you have concluded, you've shown that groups of privileged individuals can change. But actually you were talking about, initially you were talking about groups of professionals, and the work really was done with professionals, but an interesting question whether it's a different situation with professionals caught up in the learning and the traditions and the practices. That's a problem that's been around for a long time with medical professionals and pretty much all professional groups. The more general question with privileged groups, they're not unsettling the same kinds of learning. They're unsettling attitudes in some fashion. Unsettling the privileged may have more to do with decolonialism than the professional conduct. I don't know if you see the distinction I'm trying to make here. We're talking about professionals with book learning as distinct from the privileged with established norms and customs and assumptions about their roles. So it seems to me there's two interesting strands that one could pursue there. But the other question is, you've shown that with small intensive learning circles, you can be pretty effective with the unsettling in the professionals. But coming from a background of work in evaluation, I guess I also have to ask the question, do you see any results from that? I mean, are the parents more likely to be looking for these services? They feel better about them? Do the actual results with the kids get better? Do you have any sense of how much has been gained as a result of the change that you've been able to introduce into the approaches that professionals are bringing?
Right. Let me try. So your first question was about the distinction between professionals, and I think and I've come across that too, because I didn't want to lump some professionals with all experts of knowledge, for instance. That's not what I try to do. I think you're right. There's the group of privileged. In this case, yes, they were professionals, but privileged can also be the teachers who stand in front of a class of students, or they can be the dads in a household, the privileged, or men versus women, all these kind of things. So in this context,
all of us white males sitting on unceded territory.
Absolutely, yes.
With attitudes and presumptions that are,
yes,
would be presumably, would have to be unsettled in different ways, I guess. It's not going to work to bring all of us into small learning circles, I guess.
No, but I like your question, because what could perhaps happen is a group of white privileged, male or white privileged folks to actually address the question, what does that mean, unceded territory? What does that mean, indigenous territory? What does it mean for me? And I can link it now to my brainwashed knowledge from economics, where individual property rights is a good thing to have because it helps in making production more efficient. But it's completely countering how sockeye salmon swims from the Okanagan to the ocean and comes back. It's completely destructive for that. So maybe there's time, I'm glad you brought it up, for a conversation around what does that mean for me, who believes in private property at my own house on my own property, and at the same time I say it's Syilx territory. Yeah. What exactly does that mean? Now working with the Syilx people, I feel a little more confident to speak this language, but I'm also aware that it's not easy. It really is very difficult. We're walking on eggshells very often, and then people are afraid that somebody might tell you, oh, this is racism. So again, I think this structure, like my presentation, or the concept of a dialogue first with a group of privileged, so in this case, white male, yes, are privileged, right? So it might make complete sense to have that conversation with colonizers, guests, settlers, to actually, on our own account, reflect on that, on our own assumptions. What does it mean to be a guest here? Rather than asking Indigenous people to relive the trauma of colonization to teach us. So this is what I think what I'm trying to say with this research, it's time for us to unsettle our own values and norms and dominant beliefs in Western society, because it doesn't match with a Syilx, which I can now say more confidently, a Syilx way of knowing and how they relate to the land. It's way, like, I'm part of the land. What is my role then? That's the reflexivity. And now I see it separate. I live across from Reserve with West Bank First Nations. There's not a lot of intermingling happening. I mean, through my work, yes, but on a day-to-day basis, right? So, so there's that piece maybe you referred to. So that's how I see privilege, and in this case, just as professionals, and professionals in my research, just like how I got indoctrinated with some of the economic laws, and I took that for granted until I worked with farmers and had a chance to unsettle. But I don't know what I don't know. Maybe I need to unsettle a whole bunch more as well, right? So, but I think you're also saying there's still valid. I can't remember who's. I was taught by this guy one session in Mahaling, and he brought up the distinction between professional and expertise. So I still believe that like somebody who knows about soil science, that's still a relevant knowledge, or somebody who knows counseling. Being a counselor doesn't make you a privileged professional but it's the context in which you need to operate, in which you have to write these reports, in which you're expected to deliver to help the person who's in need. Those expectations, the job descriptions, the accountability framework, that causes the stigma, not your expertise in counseling or your expertise as a soil scientist to help a small farmer. Yeah, I played with that. That was a little bit of an interesting sort of play around expert knowledge and professional knowledge or taken for granted knowledge. So you're right, there's definitely a distinction. And then we had, what was your second question again?
Oh, it was the question, have you seen results
Right.
from the change in approach that the folks you were unsettling might have brought to their work?
Thank you for that question. I appreciate it. So as in the beginning of my, and I'm a strong believer of social constructivism and ongoing change. So now I'm a doctor, I have something on paper, I have done research, and I'm not dismissing that it wasn't valuable or I'm not proud of it, I am. But at the same time, it's only one piece of knowledge in time. So with the same folks, after I did my defense and everything, we did another focus group number 12, which was a reflection on this whole research. And they were so excited to come and sort of share, and they were so surprised to see how much of the actual dialogue that brought into the research. So in terms of what happened as a result of this, I can't really speak much more than the folks that we did the research with, right? So although I can quote some of their stories, and maybe another aha moment here. So some of the professionals then mentioned, what was he said? It was really difficult for them because these professionals are bound by, the funding, and of course the board members are often prestigious folks in the community, and they make sure that the funds come in. And how do they make sure the funds come in? Well, it's still based on very much sort of the system we operate in. So one professional sort of shared this experience, a very disheartening experience of board members wanting, I think it was food hampers, and then they wanted to demonstrate how this was beneficial to the whole community so they could then apply for more funding. So it's basically, again, this means and ends confusion, right? And they felt quite embarrassed by that kind of challenge because they, as professionals, were asked to ask the clients, could you tell the story at our board meeting? And if you tell the story, just really tell how an organization has helped you, then maybe we can give you 2 food hampers instead of 1. And this is often sort of the thinking, and there could be good intentions, but often there's asking that is reliving the same trauma, is asking a lot, and often that gets missed. And so I don't want to be too quick with judging, but I know from the professionals, they said that was something that they've learned, and they've also been able to speak out in their own team meetings, some of the things that they unsettled, and they then pass on to others. But I have to say, it's not that simple, because unsettling takes a long time. It takes, like, in this research, it took 11 focus groups for about 8 people to unsettle their own thinking. And yes, they are, of course, putting that into practice change, but it doesn't change the job description. We haven't changed the ministry's approach to that. So I'm still struggling with that question as to how to create more critical mass, how to expand it. And I'm secretly hoping that I can make a lot of money by setting up a consultancy firm and do a lot of research and a lot of dialogue groups in the colonial institutions. So I'm for hire, I can,
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you, Rod.
I can jump
Oh,
in.
good.
I guess I was just sort of thinking about that on the same scale is, what we're struggling with right now is not always listening to some people, but a lot of the alienation that's happening, so populism is taking hold because a lot of people are feeling alienated. So I was kind of wondering what you were seeing on how you know, you wanna unsettle and you wanna bring people, but you don't wanna alienate someone because of their privilege. You wanna make sure they're understanding of it and bringing in. So do you see ways of kind of pulling them back in so there's some kind of communication? Because what we're doing now is also not as good, right? We're creating this as well by trying to say, these people, you should be unsettled now, and then people have a fear response, right? Like, oh, now I need my land, you know, those kinds of pieces. My jobs is a good one.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, no. Well, that's a big topic. Structure my thoughts a little bit, but two words, and if I forget the second, shame and racism. And that I'll sort of build the response around. So I think like what I was aiming for a little bit is to build on the notion, okay, stigma, nobody is an explicit sort of stigmatizer, like this woman was saying too. But implicitly and unwittingly, we are. Just like as a white person, if I don't question things around property and title and rights, then and we are the ones in positions of power with federal government, provincial government, then it doesn't happen, right? So then that gets really complicated then. Sorry, I wanted to say something else there. So shame. So I wanted to play on that a little bit, that it's I may not necessarily be a blatant, explicit racist. However, I'm still contributing to a predominantly racist society just by not questioning certain things or by doing certain things that I might not necessarily think. I've got one example that was a big aha moment for me. As I mentioned, we had 2 participants in the focus group who were Indigenous, and I got one phone call on Thursday. So the focus groups were always on Friday. On Thursday nights, I get a phone call from one of the participants. And said, hey, yeah, because we were rotating all that, like we had 12 organizations with 12 professionals from this organization. We were rotating to create some buy-in as well. And so for people to show and sort of share. So at this point, we were gonna meet at the YMCA. I can say that because I'm not mentioning names, but at the YMCA, this person who obviously doesn't work at the YMCA, okay, I'm getting risky territory here, but doesn't work at the YMCA, but we really want to know, Menno, where is this? How do I get there? So, well, because I cannot be late. And she just kept saying that Thursday night on a call. Menno, where is it? Where is it? I cannot be late. I said, hey, just do as I did, blame it on traffic. It's no problem. You know, what's that? No, because nobody, like, I'm Indigenous, and if I come late and I want to build some credibility with this group of wonderful people, if I come late, then you see they judge straight away, and it comes out as Indian time, and then all my credibility is out the window, and they don't see me as a full human being with capacities and skills. They just see me as the Indian who comes late. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody would think that way, but this is how stigma operates in society. This is what Indigenous people are faced with on a very daily basis. And this is what single moms are faced with. They have to get up earlier than every other one, not because they're single moms, no, because they have to be extra careful that their kids' shoes are laced properly, dressed properly, the homework is done, and you catch everything, or else it's going to be blamed on the label single motherhood. So now I'm trying to get back to your question. Do you see opportunities there? Yeah, I do think there's lots of opportunities, because I think a lot of the judgments and your populism, yeah, we blame it often on the labels, but it's also blamed on the cause is also a lot of ignorance, because we do not, and even if we don't ask the questions, I can get mad, like you should be asking those questions. But if there's no space, if you have to feed 2 kids as a single mom, you do not have time to think. And in your work situation, the workload is so high. I hear that from my own wife working at Interior Health. It's so incredible dire right now. You're busy meetings and helping people, and you don't have even time to think back. What does this helping look like? Like, it's actually counterproductive to the community infrastructure. We're doing more damage, but we don't have time. So creating these, so this is my hope, and this is my desire, sort of, we need to create, doesn't matter how or where, it could be sort of in West Bank, there's not a lot of engagement of youth, but if we set up a skating rink where youth can come and parents feel safe, and then at least we start some engagement where people can interact, and even better, like a facilitated dialogue around these tough questions around racism or shaming, because I think shaming someone doesn't really help somebody to question their own taken for granted assumptions. So yes, I'm in agreement. So I see a lot of opportunity to create these spaces for this unsettling. It has to be unsettling because we need to unsettle our own assumptions around how we judge others, and not jump quickly to you're poor because you didn't do an education. But what really does that mean? So there's a lot to unpack there, but I think there's a lot of opportunity. I see a lot of opportunities, especially because now it's unsettling with groups who are privileged, and if we build a trust around it, that a lot can be achieved, but with the group who, organized around a specific theme. So we want to, Stigma was specifically around professionals and clients and how parents and professionals are interconnected, or not for that matter. Land, title, and rights, racism. Yeah, let's have a group of white folks to actually unpack that a little bit more before we judge Indigenous people don't pay taxes as much as our land is theirs, but to know the history or to link it to things that are really rich and what I now understand. But when I came here, I didn't know what I now know, and I still don't know what I don't know. So, but there is space to learn, and just look at soccer and you learn a lot.
Well, and look at the last 2 hour and a half we've had together and all the learning that's our so. I have one last question for you, and I know we're kind of running out of time, but I do appreciate the introduction whereby you were locating yourself in terms of a family genealogy and all. But I wonder if having unsettled this in a nice way, if you could also just say something very quickly about your PhD. Congratulations. Can you tell us a little bit about the title and the when you completed it, and this sort of those sorts of credentials that often get put on the very first introductory slide.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it was a process, let's put it that way. It was a journey. I'll speak a little bit about it. My original idea.
Give us the title? The
what?
The title.
The title of the actual thing is also the title of this talk.
Okay.
Well, more or less.
Okay.
The framework for dialogue to unsettle taken for granted knowledge with a group of professionals.
Okay.
So, but title is a title.
Yeah.
Yes. But no, the original idea, what I wanted to do, I didn't want to do a PhD just I did my bachelor's, I did my master's, and then my PhD straight away afterwards. I wasn't even sure whether I wanted to do a PhD, because as I learned more about these power dynamics, I don't want my PhD to be in the way of the work that I do. I don't want people to judge me, because I'm already white, I'm already well educated, I'm already male. Like, do I really need a PhD to justify my authority? And I didn't want that to get in the way. So I was always a bit hesitant around it. At the same time, I was really, because I was big in community development and big in learning from community members and participatory development, but I hadn't really done sort of digging deeper from a critical and theoretical perspective, and I was looking forward to do that. And those ideas sort of emerged from looking at economics differently. So that's why I started in Thailand working with, originally with community currency systems as a way to counter sort of the globalized money system, and as well as linking it to the market system. So we started to unsettle the monetary system, and I wanted to orient my PhD a little bit around that. But I didn't. But the original thought of challenging certain knowledges, that sort of remained. And then when I came to the Okanagan, I sort of morphed it into, because I got really excited about salmon, so then I was going to do it about what is an indigenous perspective to the value of salmon versus a non-indigenous. So how is it that we have farmed salmon in superstore as well as wild sockeye salmon, but what's the difference? So I wanted to unpack that, also unsettled knowledge in a way. But that proved sort of, from a university, bureaucratically, sort of with all the ethics and all that proved a little bit difficult. So I fell back into the early childhood development field, where I knew everybody, where there was so much, like I know you, there's trust already. It's the same question, whether I apply it to salmon or stigma, it doesn't really matter. I'm interested in the underlying thinking around this unsettling of knowledges. And so that's how it ended. And then, of course, with family and other work, it still was a long process. And I should say, there was quite a bit of pushback from the university too. Informally, I should say, this is too much work. You have 11 focus groups and you need to transcribe it, film it, and then you have all these semi-structured interviews. Doing this participatory, it'll take a long time. It's a lot of work, and it was. But I stuck with it because I wanted this not to just a process to get my PhD, because often it's the only PhD is a dumb PhD, right? Or whatever they say. But I wanted to follow my own values to doing this work how I felt it's supposed to be done. And so I stuck with it with help and support of people within the university as well. And so we made it to the finish line.
Well, congratulations, yeah. Yeah, please join me in thanking them for